You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome to the first Today's Wills and Probate podcast of 2023. It's a new year. I have a new guest, somebody we have not had on the podcast before. My thanks to Daniel Curran, founder and MD of Finders International, for joining. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Danny.
That's a pleasure, David, and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. Danny, as I said, founder and MD of Finders International. You're going to tell us so much more about that, and probably an awful lot better than I am. And today we're going to talk about genealogy, what you do in the industry, some of the different services that Finders offer, but also I'm very interested in some of those anecdotal stories as well that you can tell us, I'm sure. Firstly, though, tell us a little bit about yourself. The 25th anniversary of Finders was in 2022, a very odd date, I remember you saying. Tell us about yourself in the first instance. How on earth did you get involved in genealogy in the first place?
Well, it's a long story, because actually I've been involved in probate research and genealogy for 30 years, since 1990. So it's 32 years now. Christ, time is moving on. My father was a private detective in the 1960s, and he started to do a bit of this kind of work while during his time as a PI. And then he formed a company called Title Research, which is another probate research company, which I joined in 1990. And then in 1997, it's a long time ago now, but there was a big family bust up, and we went our separate ways. So it's all healed now. Time has healed all the rifts. But I basically just started again, because our Title Research, I built up the company through kind of a certain area, mainly areas of work that were competitive. And my belief was I could make bigger breakthroughs in the competitive arena, which was dominated by a couple of other firms. So when I started Finders, my first port of call was to work on what we call public domain cases. And my routine was the Bona Vacantia division advertised unclaimed estates in the newspapers in the 90s. And it was fairly predictable, sort of every Tuesday and Thursday, something like that. So what I did is I went down to King's Cross Station, where they dropped off the newspapers at midnight, and literally got them off the back of the lorry. So while my competitors were sleeping, I went off to the office and did all the research myself on microfiche, because obviously pre-internet. Mm-hmm. And with a bit of luck and judgment, I managed to crack a few cases that way, and then I'd go off on the weekend and visit the beneficiaries and sign them up. It was just very hard work. I just had to do it. I knew what I was doing, and I'd had a lot of experience. And actually, following on from that, once the name I started to advertise the name, and people, got to know that I had a new company. There were a lot of lawyers that had used me at my previous employment, so they kind of followed me to Finders. And there we are. So to cut a long story short, I've now got about 100 employees and 50 freelance retired police officers on our team, and offices in London, Edinburgh, Dublin, and Sydney in Australia. So it's been a long journey. And it's not over yet, but it's from very humble beginnings. So that's how I started.
Quite incredible. And you talk about the fact that you went down to King's Cross, got the paper off the back of the lorry. We're going to talk about how the industry's changed, because you're absolutely right. You started this business pre-internet. What has the impact of the internet and technology been on genealogy services? Because I'm very naive about these things. I look at social media, Facebook, that kind of thing. There was what was that website years ago, Friends Reunited?
Yes.
All that kind of stuff. The internet really changed this industry, presumably.
Yeah, as I say, the records we rely on, vital records, the key records to any family tree: birth, marriage, and death indexes. So when I started, they were all the master copies, if you like, a big, huge kind of about 50, 60 centimeter high books, with hard covers and leather handles, and they stored them all on the shelves at St. Catherine's House. And it was physical. So you go down there and you hoik these great big books off the shelf, slam them on the bench behind you, and flick through like a telephone directory when you're looking up a birth entry. So everyone's in these books. When you look up the name like a birth entry, like a telephone directory, and from then that information you can build up a family tree. So the internet, I think I had an early dial-up, which you remember the modem, the dial-up modems, and they sounded like a fax machine.
Yeah.
And then the unpredictable nature of whether that would even work. But in the early days, you'd get, as you say, Friends Reunited was one of the early ones, but there wasn't any great deal of information until I'd say at least 5 or 6 years further down the line. Then it started to become more of a thing. I was actually involved in the early discussions on a product which ended up being Find My Path. But I was busy with setting up my own business, so I didn't get involved. Which probably not, I should have done really with hindsight. It's obviously made a lot of money, but there you go. So that we always knew that these products were in the making. We knew what Ancestry were up to. We were in touch with Americans and what they were doing, so we knew it was coming. But even now, we've kept all these original microfiche in the office. We've got every single birth, marriage, and death entry on microfiche from 1837 to when they stopped making them, which I think is around about 2000. So we bought them all. You had to buy a copy of these microfiche. Birth, marriage, death, every single person in England and Wales is on them. And a manual search. So if you imagine that if you're filling in a web form to try and find someone's date of birth, you're probably looking at like 10, 20 second, 30-second operation. So that would take at least half an hour for that one search. And if it's a common surname, even longer. So the internet transformed the speed, but also it's like many things, double-edged sword. It increased the number of errors because the scanning errors, you're scanning old documents, and therefore the OCR recognition, the optical character recognition, the scanning software has to be super reliant in terms of translating all that into readable entries, which are then digitized. So the skills then became more around what if they've missed something, what if it's spelt wrong, how do we investigate further, how do we verify what we found out. So obviously the ultimate verification is then to find the descendants on that branch of the family and talk to them. And see if it matches up. If they remember, of course, they might not even know their own ancestry, so you might be on a bit of a hiding to nothing there. But at least you could then make some progress, and sometimes it works out quicker. But even today, you can't really, you hope it's right, and most of the time it's good. But there's still many situations where the fact that the internet records, especially for the UK, are good, doesn't shortcut any process, especially when the research goes abroad.
I think you're alluding to this next question in what you said, but do you face the same issues today that you faced 25 years ago? And if they're different, how are they different?
I'd say they're different issues because obviously we're now the biggest company in the UK in our field, and we've got a huge number of staff. So personally, my day-to-day work is very different. I don't do the casework anymore. The one thing that I'm doing more of that I always wanted to happen was to deal with the industry regulation, to become a kind of face for the industry and do all the media work and press and TV. I've done over 150 radio, press, interviews, TV.
You've now appeared on the Today's Wills and Probate podcast.
My career has now reached a new high by being on the TWP podcast. So I've kind of I want to, and every time I've done these shows, I've always tried to highlight the positivity. There's what the one thing that hasn't changed is that most firms in this arena wanted to be, and still want to be, kind of what they call under the radar. So they want to be doing this sort of dark art that no one really knows much about. And this really came to a head when we were on BBC One Air Hunters. So that was on TV for 12 series, and it's still repeated endlessly on minor channels. Mm-hmm. So when we started doing that, we decided to really go for it and really professionalize it, the way we did it, the way we even got a stylist in to help us with what we should wear, how we should talk, what we should do. And we presented it in our best possible way, because I'm a firm believer, if you're going to do it properly. Don't sort of stand there in your worst nylon shirt looking sweaty and awkward. You just do it to the best of your ability. So we did that, and on the back of that, that's when I started to do all the press and TV throughout because it generated a lot of interest in the public. And therefore the things that haven't changed, as I say, is that there was a great deal of resentment and animosity from within the industry. Firms saying, why are you doing this show? What a stupid idea. Why have you done that? And really anti it. And those of us that were on it were just realizing that if you can't beat them, join them. I mean, there are times in business where you have to make a business decision. It might not be one you like, but once we'd made that decision to do it and to seize it, take the bull by the horns and to do it properly, we became the leading voices in our industry, but our turnover grew. We were easily recognized by it. Wasn't so much a show for professionals, it was a show for the public. So when you're knocking on the door of someone's house, or one of our representatives is, quite often they'd go in and we'd be on the TV sitting right in front of them. So because it was a daytime program on BBC One, and many people saw it during its height. So on the back of that, we gained a lot of reassurance from the public, thinking we're not a scam, it's not a weird thing going on. The professionals, neither here nor there, they didn't really have an opinion, but a lot of the people within the industry were really anti and vocal about how dreadful air hunters are. And even to this day, some of the firms in the industry put their emphasis on how how wrong they think certain things we do is, and these are people in the same industry. It's really odd, and I've never understood it, because we're very lucky. We have good news stories. All of our work is about good news. It's bittersweet, of course, especially when someone's died and we have to break that news to relatives. But how lucky are we that we can actually effectively tell people they're a lottery winner every day or every week.
Did bringing genealogy services and air hunting to wider public attention benefit the industry as a whole, do you think?
I think the one area where the TV show was kind of contradictory was that we were trying to, at the same time, I started a self-regulatory body 6 years ago, the first one of its kind in our industry, called the International Association of Professional Probate Researchers. And there's a large number of international members now. We have an AGM, IAPPR.org is the website if people are interested. So we've introduced self-regulation in an unregulated industry, codes of conduct, codes of ethics, and all that kind of thing. And that was kind of in response, in a way, to the people watching the TV show thinking, oh, I'll give that a go. And, as people do. Now, some of those people gave it a go and were okay with it. But what people don't realize is that some people ended up in jail having done it, because, and this is the weird thing, to get to the bottom of this, in this world of anti-money laundering and proving our shoe size before we can do anything, when the Treasury solicitor, the Bona Vacantia division, admits a claim, they give you details of where the assets are, and you write to them and you say, I represent them, and they just hand over the money. So some people were tempted to run off with the money, because you don't have to be a solicitor to receive the money. It can go to an unregulated firm. We represent the next of kin. hand over the money, and they do. And, at some point you're living in a world where information is everywhere, the internet is everywhere. You've got to be more transparent. You've got to show your hand in some ways and prove to people that you're running a business fairly and professionally.
What about lawyers themselves then? Do you see that lawyers have benefited from this, I suppose, boom in interest in genealogy?
Okay, this is a great example because there's stories that I could bore you endlessly with stories, but the amount of times that solicitors have come to us and said, this is the sole heir, or this is the only one, or we know it's going to go to cousins, there's no closer relatives to the deceased, he's only got these distant cousins. The amount of times that's been wrong, and there's no obligation legally on them to check everything, because they appoint a personal representative who could be the deceased cousin, and you say to that cousin, do you want us to check there's no one that's entitled before you? What's your answer going to be? Probably, no, I think we'll leave it at that, and hand over the money. So there needs to be, in my view, something compelling solicitors to check, to verify the family tree. And in other countries abroad, it is part of the legal process. You have to do it. And like I say, the amount of times, last week there was a set of cousins referred to us, and we found that the deceased had half-blood siblings that no one knew about. A massive story about a lady called Margaret Abbots last year in the Daily Mail, who was a half-sister to a lady she'd only met once as a baby. And again, the solicitors came to us with cousins saying that, can you just verify the family tree? So great praise to those solicitors who think like that, who think let's check, and let's make sure we check, because I wouldn't begin to count there must be millions that have been distributed wrongly over the years. We've got an office in Ireland, and Ireland are the worst for this because they all think they know each other, and they couldn't possibly have had illegitimate children because they're Catholic, and that would never happen, of course. So you have a solicitor in Ireland will say, oh yeah, Paddy down the road, he told me that he's only got 2 brothers and that's it. Well, of course, they don't tell you about the story of the one that went to America and, had loads of kids and whatever. So, and these are the things that happen to us every day, I'd say every week there's something like this happens. So please, if you're a solicitor, listen to this. Think about verification. It can be cheap, it can be free in some cases, but it's well worth doing. And then on the back of that, you can insure against beneficiaries turning up, and ones that were missed, even by us. That does happen. And then the insurance policy will take care of any unpaid inheritances.
I think it's probably fair to say historically that if you had a sort of murky family background, you weren't particularly transparent about it. These days, you've got a huge rise in divorce, you've got blended families, you've got a very different demographic, I suppose, societal demographic. Does that change the way that you work? Has that made your job more difficult?
Yeah, in some ways, the changes in society patterns will alter our thinking on how we go about the research, because we're not automatically thinking people will be getting married, and if they do, we're not automatically thinking they're going to change their name. Like the woman will change the surname. In my own family, the women haven't changed their names. So we have to bear all these changes and patterns in behaviour. So instead of just because someone's married doesn't mean that they're going to change their name. And people can change their name at any time anyway using deeds. So you have to bear that in mind. Someone might be more inclined to change their name. Although most people, it's still, you have to register births by law. The fact of that birth certificate doesn't necessarily mean that person named on that birth certificate is the person that you end up looking for, because of all these name change items and everything else. And people are often known by a name that is not on the birth certificate. and that becomes their common usage name, or they use their middle name as their first name, or whatever. It happens all the time. So there's all these variations. Some are historically you would have looked for a full set of certificates, birth, marriage, death, and glean most of the information from those facts of life. The marriage sometimes doesn't feature, but then you can be fairly confident that that person was a bachelor or a spinster and didn't leave any issue. And these days you can't. You have to find other ways to check. So it's more about, and ironically, the thing that still benefits us hugely on this is the fact that we have these 50-odd retired policemen on the road knocking on doors, asking questions, speaking to the neighbours, because you can go on any database you like, but they're not going to tell you that someone might have had a kid with another woman down the road 20 years ago. It doesn't say that on these databases, and they're not going to brag about it on social media necessarily. So funnily enough, ironically, you go full circle and you have to go and talk to them. But you have to pick up the phone and have a decent chat with them, or send someone round there to talk to them. So it's a blended thing. Yes, you can get basic information quicker on the internet, but sometimes the old methods are the only way to find things out.
You've talked about your experience on television. I can't decide whether you enjoyed it or not, Danny. Did you enjoy it?
I did very much. Yeah, it was a bit nerve-wracking, like when you do This Morning or something like that the first time, live TV. Because it's going through your head, this is live, I can't do anything wrong. But actually, yeah, it's fine. Well, maybe I was lucky. It took me 2 minutes to get used to it, and I was fine with it. And then I've done quite a few things since. I was on live TV last weekend, actually, on Talk TV, with Trisha Goddard. You might remember from she had a kind of Jerry Springer type show.
Cat show, wasn't it? That's right. Yeah.
So she's on Talk TV now. So yeah, I'm happy to do it. And like I say, the reason I think that it's good that I'm doing this is because I'm trying to promote the positive and the responsible and the professional side of the industry.
So go on then. What's next for Finders? And I'm also very interested, given what you've said about your ambitions for the industry, what do you think is next for the industry as a whole, Danny?
Well, I think for the industry as a whole, I'd like to see, as we touched on before, I'd like to see more people signing up to self-regulatory bodies to make sure that they're watching their own behaviour and codes of conduct and everything else. And if there could be some formal regulator, that would be absolutely fine. It'd be a good thing for us, because it could only mean that we are trusted more by the legal profession. I'm not saying we're not trusted by them, but there is that's always been the struggle over the last 30 years, is to be taken as a key part of the legal profession, legal service. And I think to a large extent we've covered that, but there's always more work to do. There's more lawyers qualifying every day. You've got to keep ramming home the message that you can't just trust what the family testimony is. You should verify things independently. The firm you use should be a firm that you trust, and you can has signed up to some kind of self-regulation like IAPPR, that kind of thing. So that's an ongoing. There are things that will always be an ongoing battle in an unregulated industry. You have to keep proving your worth and your standing and everything else. The company's grown organically since they started, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down. So I think for Finders itself, we'd like to be opening more offices in different countries, as and where we can, because you often have a local contact who can do research for you. But when we started in Australia, opening the office in Australia, it was because those contacts, they change, and they get older, they retire, they move on. So we built up this amazing network. We traced in the last year, we just did the statistics. We traced over 11,000 beneficiaries in 66 different countries around the world.
Wow. So
we do have the reach and the ability to get in touch with people in a vast number of countries. But that scene is always shifting. Ukraine was, there's a lot of Ukrainians who went to the States and died, and their relatives will be back in the Ukraine. And that, of course, everything to do with Ukraine is like indefinitely on hold now. And if you think back through history, Poland has changed its borders more times than you can think to remember. So keeping that international network live and growing the association that we belong to is good, because you need to keep updating your information, your resources and everything else. It's a constant. The field, it never stands still, like in many fields. That I think finance in the future has to remain agile, quick to respond to changes, and on top of the regulatory or self-regulatory regime. So that's where I hope we go in the future, and we make maximum use of our contacts in that way. So that's my ambitions for the company.
Do you see that there's any opportunity for intervention in the regulatory side of things? Some sort of government or quasi-government intervention to set some standards in this industry?
As I said before, I wouldn't mind if there was. That'd be fine, absolutely fine. I'd welcome it, as long as we could be part of the process. And it'd be so horrible to have a set of rules just thrown on you. But I don't think that's the way it really works. So, yeah, we have, as far as we can, we check our processes with the SRA. Anyone that a solicitor, an SRA regulated solicitor, employs to do a certain area of work should be in compliance with the SRA code insofar as where that touches upon that area of work. So we're always aware of that, and we're always trying to make sure that we don't venture into territory that would cause our clients difficulties. It wouldn't be us, of course, because we're not the regulated ones. The reason I don't think it'll be regulated is because simply the probate research industry isn't really big enough to warrant an independent regulator. So self-regulation, I think, would be, if we get to the point where a solicitor thinks, well, they're not part of this IAPPR, so we're not using them, that would be great. But in the meantime, the IAPPR is there also as an advisory thing for if beneficiaries are contacted out of the blue by someone, they think it's a scam, they can go online and hopefully find IAPPR and get a reference from the company secretary to tell them whether the company is genuine or not. Going back to the TV show, that's the big one for the public. Anyone who's done that TV show for that length of time gives them great reassurance, I think.
It's an area that I find fascinating, and I can probably talk to you for much of the rest of the day about it, Danny, but we're fast running out of time. It's been great to have you on the podcast. I really appreciate you joining, and thank you for sharing your insight.
No, it's a pleasure. And if ever the surname Opie comes up in a family tree,
don't contact me, for goodness sake.
You don't want the money.
The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todayswillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Danny. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.